I carried the $350,000 check against my chest like it was proof that I mattered. 2 years of depositions, courtrooms, and cold stares had finally paid off. I remember standing on the porch that evening, rehearsing how I would tell him, how I would say, "We're safe now." I fixed it. But when I pushed the door open, the house answered me with silence. No TV humming, no dishes clinking, no half-finished argument waiting in the kitchen. Just empty walls and the echo of my own footsteps. His shoes were gone. His jackets were gone. The framed photo from our 20th anniversary was missing from the hallway. On the counter sat his wedding ring and a single folded note. I won the lawsuit. So why did it feel like I had just lost everything? If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from, and what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. I walked out of the courthouse with the check pressed flat against my chest, as if the wind might snatch it away and undo the last 2 years of my life. $350,000. The number looked unreal in black ink, almost obscene. For a second, I let myself feel it, the validation, the quiet vindication, the proof that I had not imagined the betrayal that started this whole fight. I had been right. The judge had said so. The law had agreed with me. I stood at the top of the courthouse steps and called my husband. It rang longer than usual. I pictured him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, one hand wrapped around a mug of coffee he always reheated twice before drinking. I imagined his voice when he picked up steady, calm, the way it always was when I came home from another exhausting hearing. He didn't answer. I told myself he was driving, or mowing the lawn, or simply tired of hearing about courtrooms and depositions and invoices from lawyers who charged by the hour to dissect our lives. I slipped the phone back into my purse and allowed the smallest smile to curve my mouth. Tonight, I would come home with good news. Tonight, it would all be worth it. The drive back to our suburban neighborhood felt shorter than usual. Every red light irritated me. Every slow car in front of me felt like an obstacle between me and the moment I had rehearsed in my head for months. I would lay the check on the kitchen table. I would say, "We're done. We don't have to fight anymore." I imagined him exhaling, imagined the tension leaving his shoulders. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed his car wasn't there. It didn't alarm me at first. He could have gone to the grocery store, or picked up our son from practice. The house looked the same, trimmed hedges, porch light off, blinds half drawn, normal, safe, ours. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Silence met me. Not the comfortable kind, not the kind that wraps around you at the end of a long day. This silence felt hollow, stretched thin across the walls. I waited for the familiar sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint murmur of the television upstairs, the creak in the hallway floorboard he always stepped on. Nothing. "Hello!" My voice sounded too loud. My heels clicked against the hardwood as I walked into the living room. The throw blanket from the couch was gone. The side table where he kept his reading glasses was bare. I moved toward the staircase slowly, my fingers trailing along the banister. Our bedroom door stood open. The closet door was wider than usual. Half the hangers were empty. I felt something tighten behind my ribs. Not panic, not yet, just a pressure, like the air before a storm. I walked back downstairs, my breathing shallow now. The kitchen light was off. The counter was clean, too clean. No mail stacked in the corner, no keys tossed carelessly near the fruit bowl. And then I saw it. On the center of the kitchen island, placed carefully as if it might tip over, was his wedding ring. Not thrown, not scratched, just set there. Beside it lay a single, folded sheet of paper. I set the check down without looking at it. My fingers hovered over the note longer than they should have. For a moment, I told myself this was dramatic, temporary, a misunderstanding that would unravel the second he walked back through that door. I opened the paper. His handwriting was steady. That hurt more than if it had been rushed. "You won," he wrote. "I hope it gives you the peace you've been chasing." My eyes scanned the rest too quickly, as if speed could soften the meaning. "I don't think there's room for me in that victory." The words blurred. I swallowed and forced myself to keep reading, but there was one line at the bottom I couldn't quite process. My hands started to tremble, and I realized the house wasn't just quiet, it was empty. I reached for my phone again and called him. This time, it didn't even ring. The call went straight to voicemail. Not even a single ring, just Daniel's steady recorded voice filling the kitchen as if nothing in the world had shifted. "You've reached Daniel. Leave a message." I stood there listening to it like it belonged to someone who had already moved on from me, even though this morning I had fully believed I would walk through that door and tell him we were finally safe. "Where are you?" "I'm home," I said after the beep, and ended the call before the word please could betray me. The refrigerator hummed, the heating system clicked on and off, the ordinary sounds of a quiet suburban house, but without him they felt mechanical, detached, as if the house were functioning out of habit rather than life. I unfolded the letter again and forced myself to read it slowly. "You won. I hope it gives you the peace you've been chasing." I almost laughed at that. I hadn't been chasing peace. I had been chasing justice, stability, proof that I wasn't crazy for feeling wronged. The next line tightened something inside my chest. "I don't think there's room for me in that victory." I looked up at the check still lying on the kitchen island, crisp and official, its edges sharp under the overhead light. It didn't look triumphant anymore. It looked misplaced, like it had been delivered to the wrong address. I walked into the living room and began to notice the quiet absences. The lamp that used to sit beside his chair was gone, leaving behind a faint outline in the dust. A few of his hardcovers were missing from the shelf, the gap too precise to be accidental. There was no sign of anger, no overturned furniture, no slammed doors frozen mid-chaos. Everything was orderly, intentional. I opened the hallway closet and saw the empty space where his navy winter jacket had hung for years, the boots he wore every morning no longer lined up by the door. Upstairs, our bedroom felt unfamiliar in its symmetry. Half of the closet stood bare, hangers spaced too evenly, and the drawer where he kept his watch and loose change had been cleared out completely, the wooden tray removed without leaving so much as a coin behind. The bed was made tightly, corners tucked in with care, and I found myself staring at it, trying to remember the last time I had paid attention to how he folded the blankets. How long had he been planning this? I replayed the past few months in my head. Me at my desk with the door half closed, legal documents stacked high, Daniel knocking once before stepping in as if he were the guest. "Just 5 more minutes," I would say without looking up, and those minutes would stretch into entire evenings. My phone vibrated in my hand and the sudden buzz startled me. For a brief second I thought it was him calling back. It wasn't. It was a bank notification. I opened it automatically, my pulse quickening as the amount came into focus. It was too large to be routine, too deliberate to be casual. I checked the date and felt my stomach drop. The withdrawal had been made the week of my final hearing. I knew every payment I had sent to the attorneys. I had tracked them obsessively. This wasn't one of them. I walked back downstairs slowly, the ring still resting on the counter beside the check, both objects catching the light in a way that felt almost staged. He had taken the money out before I won, before the verdict, before today turned into whatever this was. And standing there between a wedding ring and a settlement check, I realized I didn't know what he had needed that money for or why he hadn't told me. I stood in the kitchen a long time, the ring and the check lying side by side under the light as if they belonged to the same story. The bank notification was still open on my phone, the withdrawal amount steady and undeniable, and I kept staring at the date as though it might shift if I blinked enough times. He had taken that money the week of my final hearing, before the verdict, before I walked out of that courtroom believing I had secured something for us. Whatever he needed it for, he had needed it while I was still fighting, while I was still telling him that once this was over, we would finally breathe again. I tried to reconstruct that week in detail. I had barely slept, living on coffee and adrenaline, rehearsing testimony in front of the bathroom mirror, correcting my own tone as if composure alone could guarantee justice. The kitchen table had been buried under binders and legal pads, highlighted passages flagged like battle plans. Daniel had stood across from me more than once, leaning against the counter, watching me move papers around as if rearranging them could control the outcome. "Do you need anything?" he had asked one night. "Just a little quiet," I replied without lifting my eyes. He had nodded slowly, and I remember now that his nod carried something heavier than agreement. At the time, I thought he was respecting my focus. Now I wonder if he was stepping back from something he already knew he was about to leave. Instead of wandering the house again, I went straight into my home office, the room that had swallowed most of the last 2 years. The air still smelled faintly of printer ink and stale coffee. My attorney's business cards were pinned neatly to the corkboard, and sticky notes with deadlines clung to the edge of my monitor like warnings I had taken seriously. The chair across from my desk sat perfectly aligned, the way Daniel always pushed it in after sitting there, waiting for me to finish just one more email. I logged into our joint account and studied the transaction more closely. It wasn't an online transfer. It wasn't a check. It was an in-person cash withdrawal at a branch less than 10 miles from our house. I could almost picture him standing at the counter, signing his name, counting bills he normally avoided carrying. Daniel disliked cash. He used to joke that it felt like something you could lose too easily. For him to withdraw that much in person meant it mattered. It meant he didn't want it traced to a vendor or a service or a receipt I could question later. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, forcing myself to see him clearly that week. He had been quieter than usual, yes, but quiet had become his language over the past year. I had mistaken it for patience, or fatigue, or simple acceptance of my obsession with winning. "Maybe it's not worth it," he had said once, standing in the doorway of this very room. "It's about principle," I answered sharply. "You don't let people get away with that." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just looked at me for a moment longer than comfortable and asked, "And what about us?" I remember turning back to my screen, telling myself I would come back to that question later. Later, when the case was over. Later, when we had the money. Later, when things were easier. But the withdrawal date told a different story. It told me that while I was preparing to win, he was preparing for something else. Something that required cash. Something he chose not to share. I went back into the kitchen and picked up his ring again, turning it slowly between my fingers. 20 years engraved inside. 20 years of mortgages, late-night talks, hospital waiting rooms, backyard barbecues, and ordinary Tuesdays. We had survived layoffs and grief and disappointment. We had endured seasons that felt far more violent than legal paperwork. And yet, somehow, this was the fracture. The money had been taken before I ever held that check in my hands. Before I stood on those courthouse steps imagining relief, he had made a decision while I was still chasing victory. Standing there between a settlement check and a wedding band, I understood something that unsettled me more than the empty closet ever could. He hadn't left impulsively. He had moved toward something quietly, deliberately, while I was too focused on winning to notice he was already preparing to walk away. I kept circling the same realization in my head, but this time I forced myself to look at it without softening the edges. While I had been building arguments for court, Daniel had been quietly rearranging his own life. The two processes had happened in the same house, under the same roof, and I hadn't noticed either one intersecting with the other. I told myself I had been under pressure, that the final hearing had consumed me, but excuses felt thinner now that I was standing in an empty garage. 3 nights before the verdict, I had been at the dining table again, legal folders spread open like a battlefield map. My attorney was on speaker, walking me through possible scenarios, what to say if the judge challenged my timeline, how to respond if opposing counsel pushed harder than expected. I remember Daniel coming in from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag, the faint scent of gasoline trailing behind him. He waited until the call ended before pulling out a chair across from me. I barely registered the way he sat down carefully, as if choosing his posture mattered. "It's almost over," I said, closing my laptop with a kind of exhausted confidence. "One more week." He folded his hands on the table. "I sold the car." I looked up, annoyed that my momentum had been interrupted. "What car?" "My Mustang." The word landed, but not with the weight it should have. That car had been his quiet pride, the thing he polished on Sunday mornings, the thing he drove with the windows down even when it was too cold. "Why?" I asked, already half turning back to my notes. "To cover the next round of legal fees," he said evenly. "I didn't want you worrying about the retainer. At the time, I interpreted it as support, commitment, proof that he believed in the fight as much as I did." "You didn't have to do that," I replied, more distracted than grateful. "We would have figured it out." "We are figuring it out," he said. I didn't ask what he got for it. I didn't ask whether he hesitated before handing over the keys. I just reopened my laptop and returned to preparing for court. Now I walked into the garage and felt the absence differently. The space where the Mustang had sat was too clean, too open. A faint oil stain marked the floor like a shadow that refused to leave. He hadn't just sold a vehicle. He had given up something that was entirely his, something untouched by mortgages and school schedules and my lawsuit. And he had done it quietly. Back inside, I replayed the sequence again. He sold the car. He withdrew a large amount of cash in person from our joint account that same week. He didn't mention either decision beyond the bare minimum. I had assumed transparency because we shared finances. I had assumed unity because we shared a bed. But assumption wasn't the same as attention. I scrolled through our messages from that week. Most of them were from me updates from my lawyer, reminders about court times, short instructions about dinner or errands. His replies were brief. Okay, got it. Proud of you. Proud of you. The words felt different now, stripped of the comfort I had once attached to them. Pride didn't mean agreement. It didn't mean he wasn't struggling. It didn't mean he wasn't preparing for a future I wasn't part of. I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the ring resting beside the settlement check. 20 years engraved inside that band. 20 years of shared decisions, or what I had believed were shared decisions. Yet in the most critical week of our marriage, he had sold the one thing that belonged solely to him and withdrawn money he never explained. He hadn't tried to stop me from winning. He hadn't fought me. He hadn't even asked me to choose. He had simply started moving pieces off the board while I was still convinced we were playing the same game. He had been moving pieces off the board while I was still arguing over rules, and the more I examined that week, the clearer it became that his silence hadn't been emptiness, it had been containment. I opened our shared calendar again and forced myself to look past my own appointments. My schedule was packed with strategy calls, deposition prep, reminders highlighted in red. His entries were sparse, almost modest by comparison. Twice, I saw it. Cardiologist, 3:15 p.m., 2 months before the hearing. The same week he withdrew the cash. I remembered the first time he mentioned it. I had been seated at my desk, legal documents stacked so high they blocked half the window. He appeared in the doorway, jacket still on, keys in his hand. "I've got an appointment tomorrow," he said. "With who?" I asked, scanning a paragraph for inconsistencies. "Cardiologist." That made me pause briefly. "Everything okay?" "They just want to run a few tests." I nodded, already turning back to the page. "Okay, let me know." He stayed in the doorway for a second longer than usual. I can see that now. At the time, I mistook it for hesitation about interrupting me. Now I wonder if it was disappointment. I searched through old messages and found one from him dated weeks earlier. Chest felt tight today. "Probably nothing." "Getting it checked," I had replied. "Good. I'm heading into a deposition." "Talk tonight." I don't remember if we ever talked about it that night. I suspect we didn't. The kitchen felt different as I stood there with that knowledge, like the air had shifted pressure. I went to the drawer near the refrigerator where we kept stray paperwork and sifted through it more carefully this time. Beneath appliance manuals and insurance cards, I found a folded envelope from the hospital network. The paper inside was crisp, clinical. It referenced diagnostic testing, follow-up imaging, monitoring for elevated risk factors. The date matched the week of the cash withdrawal. I read it twice. Insurance had covered part of the cost. There was still a balance due, but the amount listed was nowhere near what he had withdrawn from our account. The cash he took was nearly 4 times higher than the bill in my hand. He hadn't needed that much just for this. Unless there were more tests, more consultations, more that he chose not to route through our joint account. I tried to picture him sitting in a waiting room alone, flipping through outdated magazines while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I imagined him in a paper gown, answering questions about family history and stress levels while I sat across town debating legal language with my attorney. I had been arguing about fairness in a courtroom while he was listening to a doctor explain the condition of his own heart. The contrast made something inside me tighten. There had been small changes I dismissed at the time. He stopped asking me to come to routine appointments. He scheduled them during hours he knew I'd be busy. Once, when I teased him about becoming that guy who obsessively monitored his health, he smiled and said lightly, "Someone has to make sure I stick around." I had laughed and returned to my laptop. Now the sentence echoed differently. I placed the hospital letter on the counter, but this time I didn't align it beside the check. I left it slightly apart, as if it belonged to a separate story I had never bothered to read. The ring caught the light faintly, a circle of metal representing promises we once recited without imagining hospital corridors or silent withdrawals. He had sold his car, he had withdrawn cash, he had seen a cardiologist more than once. None of those actions were dramatic on their own, but together, they formed a pattern I had overlooked because I was focused on winning. He hadn't accused me. He hadn't demanded I slow down. He hadn't asked me to choose between the lawsuit and him. Instead, he had adjusted quietly, handling his fear in private, making financial decisions without inviting discussion. And somewhere between my closing arguments and his test results, he decided he would face whatever was coming without leaning on me. If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from? And what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. And somewhere between my closing arguments and his test results, he decided he would face whatever was coming without leaning on me, and the weight of that realization pressed down slowly. Not like a shock, but like something that had been building for months without my consent. I found myself walking upstairs to our son's room almost without thinking, as if some instinct was guiding me toward the one person who might have seen what I refused to. He was sitting at his desk with his headphones resting around his neck, scrolling through his phone, and when he looked up at me I could see that he already sensed something had shifted in the house. I asked him if his dad had said anything before leaving, and he hesitated just long enough to make my pulse tighten before answering, "Not today." The wording caught me. Not today meant there had been other days. I stepped inside and sat on the edge of his bed, asking what he meant, and he told me Daniel had been different for a while, that he would sit at the kitchen table late at night after I went upstairs to my office, just sitting there under the light, sometimes staring down the hallway toward my closed door. The image landed harder than I expected. I had believed those late nights belonged to my determination, to my sacrifice for our future, but apparently they had also belonged to his waiting. I asked if Daniel had said anything else, and our son told me that one evening he had asked whether I seemed happy. Happy. Not whether I was winning, not whether the case looked strong, just whether I seemed happy. Our son said he told him I was stressed, that it would pass, and then he added quietly that Dad didn't look angry, just tired. The words stayed with me, tired not in the way someone is after a long day, but the kind that settles into your shoulders when you've been carrying something heavy alone. I asked if Daniel had told him about the cardiologist, and he nodded, saying Dad mentioned his heart was acting up, but told him not to make a big deal out of it. I felt something twist inside me at the thought that my husband had shared even a fraction of his health concerns with our son, while I had responded to his original message about chest tightness with a distracted good before. Heading into a deposition. I had convinced myself I was fighting for fairness, for principle, for stability, but I had not once paused long enough to sit in a waiting room beside him. When I asked if he knew where his father had gone, our son shook his head, but told me that last week Daniel had said something strange, something he hadn't understood at the time. Sometimes you can win something and still lose what matters. Hearing those words spoken back to me in my own house felt like standing in front of a mirror I had avoided. I thanked my son and left his room slowly, walking down the hallway toward my office, noticing how the door stood slightly ajar, just as it had for most of the past 2 years, not fully closed but never truly open either. I stepped inside and looked at the desk crowded with files, the corkboard covered in reminders, the chair across from me that Daniel used to sit in when he tried to talk. I had thought I was fighting for us, but from where he stood, it must have looked like I was choosing something else entirely. He hadn't left in a burst of anger or a dramatic argument. He had waited, through appointments and late nights and careful conversations that I half heard. And when the verdict finally came down in my favor, when I walked out of that courthouse believing everything would settle back into place, he had already reached the quiet conclusion that he could no longer sit at that table hoping I would come downstairs. When I stepped out of my office and back into the hallway, the house felt heavier, as if it were holding its breath along with me. Daniel hadn't stormed out, hadn't slammed a door or shattered a glass to mark the moment he decided he'd had enough. He had waited, and then he had moved quietly. That kind of departure leaves no noise to blame, only space. I walked downstairs again, this time not looking for what was missing but for what might explain how he left. The living room looked almost staged in its orderliness. Cushions aligned, surfaces cleared, the absence of his things more deliberate than accidental. I stood in the center of the room and tried to picture the last time he had been there alone, perhaps the night before the verdict, perhaps the morning of it, standing in this same spot and deciding something final. My eyes drifted toward the small security camera mounted high in the corner near the staircase, the one we installed years ago when break-ins had been reported in the neighborhood. I hadn't thought about it in months. Without allowing myself too much time to reconsider, I pulled up the app on my phone and scrolled back through the recorded footage from the night before I won the case. The timestamp glowed faintly at the bottom of the screen, 11:47 p.m. The house was dim, lit only by the kitchen light left on above the stove. Daniel appeared in the frame a few seconds later, walking slowly into the living room. He wasn't carrying luggage. He wasn't rushing. He stood there for a moment, hands at his sides, looking around as if committing the room to memory. I watched him on my phone the way one watches a stranger in a documentary, removed, detached, until I realized this was the last version of him inside our house. He walked over to the couch and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He stayed that way for a long time. The timestamp jumped forward in quiet increments, while he remained almost still. At 12:03 a.m., he stood and walked toward the hallway, stopping directly in front of my office door. The camera angle couldn't show inside the room, but I knew exactly what he would have seen. The glow of my desk lamp under the crack of the door, my silhouette hunched over paperwork. He didn't knock. He didn't reach for the handle. He just stood there. I felt my throat tighten as I watched him hesitate. After a few seconds, he turned away and walked back into the living room. He reached up to his left hand and slid off his wedding ring, not in anger, not with any dramatic gesture, but slowly, as if the metal had grown heavier than it once was. He looked down at it in his palm for a moment, then crossed into the kitchen and placed it carefully on the island. Even through the grainy footage, I could see the deliberateness in the motion. He didn't cry. He didn't pace. He didn't collapse. He walked upstairs, out of frame. The timestamp shifted again. 12:27 a.m. He reappeared, this time carrying a single duffel bag. Not large, not packed for a lifetime. Just enough for a few days, maybe more. He paused once more in the center of the room, glancing toward the hallway where my office door stood closed. For a heartbeat, I thought he might turn back. Instead, he picked up his keys from the small bowl near the door and left. The door closed gently behind him. No slam, no echo. I stared at the frozen frame long after the footage ended, my own reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. He hadn't left because he stopped loving me. He hadn't left in fury. He had left after standing outside my door and realizing I wasn't coming out. And I had been inside, rehearsing how to win. I kept staring at the frozen frame on my phone until the screen dimmed and my own reflection replaced his image entirely, and for a moment I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. Daniel hadn't left in anger or desperation. He had left after standing outside my office door and realizing that whatever he needed from me in that moment, I wasn't going to offer it. I tried to remember what I had been doing at 12:03 a.m., the night before the verdict. I was probably reviewing closing notes, maybe rereading the summary my attorney had drafted, convincing myself that every sacrificed dinner and missed conversation would make sense once the judge ruled in my favor. While I was preparing to win, my husband had been preparing to walk out quietly enough that I wouldn't even hear the door close. I replayed the footage once more, watching the way he removed his ring not as a declaration, not as a punishment, but as if he were setting something fragile down. That detail unsettled me more than anything else. If he had been furious, I could have blamed an argument. If he had been reckless, I could have blamed fear. But what I saw was composure, acceptance, a man who had already exhausted the hope that I would meet him halfway. I lowered the phone and looked around the living room as if the furniture might confirm what I had just witnessed. The couch, the lamp, the faint outline where his books had been, it all seemed arranged around a quiet ending I had failed to notice forming. I walked into the kitchen again and picked up the duffel bag he had left behind in the corner by the pantry. I hadn't even registered it earlier, assuming it belonged to our son. It was empty now, collapsed in on itself, as if it had already served its purpose and returned to waiting. The sight of it made my chest tighten. He hadn't planned a dramatic escape. He had packed only what he needed. My phone buzzed suddenly in my hand, jolting me. It wasn't Daniel. It was a text from a mutual friend asking if everything was okay. The message was casual. "Haven't seen you guys in a bit, all good?" But it felt like an intrusion into something I hadn't even processed myself. I typed back a vague response and set the phone down, resisting the urge to call every number that might lead me to him. Part of me was afraid that if I moved too quickly, I would confirm that this separation was real. Instead, I went back to the kitchen island and stared at the hospital letter again. The dates aligned too neatly now. The cardiologist appointment, the cash withdrawal, the sale of the Mustang, the quiet removal of his ring. These were not random acts of a man overwhelmed in a single night. They were decisions made over time. The footage had only shown me the final step. I opened the banking app once more and looked at the branch location listed beside the withdrawal. It was only 10 miles away, close enough that he could have driven there during lunch or between appointments. I imagined him standing at the counter, asking for cash while the teller counted out bills, his expression neutral, his mind already somewhere beyond this house. The amount still bothered me. It was more than a short-term medical expense, more than a spontaneous getaway would require, unless he had needed it for something I hadn't considered. The thought crept in slowly. What if he wasn't just preparing to leave me, but preparing for something medically serious? Something that required privacy, autonomy, control. The hospital letter had mentioned elevated risk, monitoring, follow-up imaging, words that sounded cautious but not catastrophic. Yet he had withdrawn far more than the bill demanded. I pressed my palms flat against the cool surface of the island and closed my eyes. I had been so certain that winning the lawsuit would restore balance to our lives. Instead, it had exposed how far out of balance we already were. Daniel hadn't tried to stop me. He had simply stepped aside, handling his health and his fear without asking for reassurance from someone who was too busy chasing validation from a courtroom. When I opened my eyes again, the house felt less like a crime scene and more like a question I hadn't answered in time. I didn't know where he was. I didn't know whether he wanted to be found. But I knew one thing with unsettling clarity. The man in that footage had not left impulsively. He had left after waiting long enough to be certain I wasn't coming downstairs. The man in that footage had not left impulsively. He had left after waiting long enough to be certain I wasn't coming downstairs, and that certainty now echoed through every room I walked into. I stood in the kitchen with my palms pressed against the counter, trying to decide whether searching for him would be an act of love or just another attempt to control an outcome. My instinct was to start dialing numbers: his brother, his closest friend, the cardiologist's office, but something held me back. If Daniel had chosen to leave quietly, perhaps chasing him immediately would only confirm that I still didn't understand what he needed. Instead, I went back to the living room and sat where he had sat in the footage, elbows on my knees, staring at the hallway that led to my office. From that angle, the door looked ordinary, just wood and paint. Yet I could suddenly see it the way he must have seen it closed more often than open, light leaking from underneath as proof that I was physically present but emotionally unreachable. I imagined him standing there that night, debating whether to knock one last time. The thought made my chest tighten. If he had knocked, would I have answered with patience? Or would I have glanced at the clock and said, "Can this wait until tomorrow?" My phone lay on the coffee table, silent, and I realized that I was waiting now in the same way he had waited, hoping for a sound that might change everything. I opened our message thread again, scrolling further back than I had before, beyond the week of the hearing, beyond the cardiologist appointment, back into months where our conversations thinned into logistics. Mixed among the short replies were occasional longer texts from him that I must have skimmed at the time. One read, "I know this case matters to you. I just don't want to lose us in the process." I had responded hours later with, "We won't. Trust me." Reading it now, I could almost hear the confidence in my own voice, the certainty that I was capable of managing both justice and marriage without sacrificing either. Another message caught my attention, sent 2 nights before the hearing. "No matter what happens next week, I hope we remember what we're fighting for." I had answered with a thumbs up emoji because I was on a call, a thumbs up. The memory burned. The pattern was undeniable now. He had been reaching in small ways, not demanding, not accusing, just reminding me that the lawsuit was not the only thing at stake. I had interpreted his restraint as agreement. In truth, it may have been resignation. I stood and walked toward the front door, opening it and stepping onto the porch as if fresh air might steady my thoughts. The neighborhood looked unchanged, mailboxes aligned, lawns trimmed, the quiet hum of evenings settling in. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed and laughter drifted faintly through the air, ordinary life continuing. I wondered if anyone had seen him leave that night, if anyone had noticed the duffel bag in his hand. The idea that he might be alone in a motel room somewhere, managing his heart condition and his disappointment at the same time, unsettled me in a way I hadn't prepared for. He had sold his car, he had withdrawn cash, he had packed lightly. None of those actions pointed to a man seeking drama. They pointed to someone who wanted to disappear without burdening the people he loved. I went back inside and picked up the hospital letter once more, tracing the date with my finger. Elevated risk, follow-up required. The words felt heavier now. What if he hadn't just been protecting himself from my neglect, but protecting me from worry? What if he believed that telling me the full truth would only distract me from winning, something he knew mattered deeply to me? The possibility unsettled me more than anger would have. I returned to the couch and sat in the quiet, replaying the image of him standing outside my office door. He had given me space, he had given me time, he had even given me victory, and in return, I had given him silence. And in return, I had given him silence, the kind that fills a room even when two people are still living inside it. I sat on the couch long after the house grew dark, replaying every small reach he had made toward me over the past year and every time I had postponed answering. The lawsuit had felt urgent, temporary, a storm we simply needed to endure. But what I failed to see was that while I was bracing against the wind, Daniel had been standing in it alone. The hospital letter lay on the coffee table now, the clinical language stark against the soft glow of the lamp. Elevated risk, follow-up required, lifestyle modification strongly advised. The phrases sounded manageable on paper, almost routine, yet paired with the image of him removing his wedding ring, they took on a different weight. I picked up my phone again, and this time I did call his brother. The conversation was brief, cautious. No, Daniel wasn't there. No, he hadn't mentioned visiting. There was a pause before his brother asked if everything was okay, and I heard myself say, "I think so," though the words felt dishonest the moment they left my mouth. After I hung up, I scrolled through Daniel's contacts in my own phone, names of colleagues, friends, neighbors, realizing how little I actually knew about where he might go if he needed space. I had always assumed that whatever he carried it here, within these walls. A thought struck me then, subtle but insistent. I opened the drawer beside the fridge again and searched more carefully, not just for bills but for documents I might have overlooked. Beneath a stack of old tax returns, I found a manila folder with our insurance information. Tucked inside was a copy of a policy I hadn't reviewed in years. My name was listed as the primary beneficiary. The coverage amount was substantial, close to the settlement I had just won. My pulse slowed as I traced the signature at the bottom. The date was recent, the week before the verdict. He had updated his life insurance days before he left. The implication settled into me with quiet force. This wasn't about anger, it wasn't even about escape, it was preparation. If his heart condition worsened, if something unpredictable happened, he wanted me protected. Protected, financially, at least. I imagined him sitting in an office signing those forms, making sure that if he became a burden or a risk, I would not pay for it. My throat tightened at the thought that he had been thinking about my security while I had been thinking about winning. I carried the folder back to the kitchen island and set it down carefully, as if it might break. The check from the lawsuit still lay there, crisp and untouched, but now it felt like an echo rather than a triumph. Daniel had mirrored my victory with a contingency plan of his own. 2 sums of money, 2 different motivations. I had fought to reclaim something I felt was taken from me. He had arranged to give something away if he was taken from us. The contrast was unbearable. I sank into a chair and stared at the policy again, noticing a handwritten note clipped to the back. It was short, almost practical, in case things change quickly. No elaboration. No dramatics. Just a statement of fact. He had not wanted to scare me. He had not wanted to distract me. He had simply made arrangements. The house felt smaller now, less like a question and more like a reckoning. He had sold his car, withdrawn cash, visited specialists, updated insurance, packed a modest bag, and stood outside my office door one final time. Every step pointed to a man who was not trying to punish me, but to spare me from medical bills, spare me from watching him weaken, spare me from choosing between his health and my ambition. I leaned forward and pressed my hands over my face, finally allowing the truth to form without resistance. I had thought the lawsuit was the biggest threat to our marriage. In reality, it had only revealed the distance that had already grown between us. Daniel hadn't left because he stopped loving me. He left because he believed he was no longer part of what I was fighting for, and because he didn't want his failing heart to become another case I had to manage. And for the first time since walking through that door with a check in my hand, I was no longer thinking about what I had won. I was thinking about how close I might be to losing him for good. I was no longer thinking about what I had won. I was thinking about how close I might be to losing him for good, and that shift in focus felt like stepping onto unstable ground after years of standing on something I thought was solid. The life insurance policy lay open on the table beside the settlement check, two documents measuring security in different ways, and I suddenly understood that Daniel had been preparing for an outcome far more permanent than a temporary separation. My hands trembled as I picked up my phone again, this time not hesitating. I called the cardiologist's office listed on the hospital letter, my voice tight but controlled as I identified myself as his wife. There were pauses, transfers, the sterile politeness of medical privacy, and then a nurse who confirmed only what she was allowed to confirm. Yes, he had been seen recently. Yes, further evaluation had been recommended. No, she could not disclose more without his authorization. Before she ended the call, she added gently, "If he experiences worsening symptoms, he should seek immediate care." The word immediate echoed in my head long after the line went dead. I stood there, phone still pressed to my ear, replaying every small sign I had dismissed. The nights he rubbed his chest absently, the way he avoided climbing stairs too quickly, the quiet exhaustion our son had described. None of it had registered as urgent because I had labeled my own crisis as the priority. I had convinced myself that once the verdict came through, we would recalibrate, reconnect, return to normal. But Daniel had not been waiting for normal. He had been measuring time in appointments and test results. My phone buzzed suddenly in my hand, and my heart jolted so sharply I had to grip the counter to steady myself. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, from a nearby city 2 hours away. For a second, I considered letting it go to voicemail, afraid of what the voice on the other end might say, but instinct overrode fear, and I answered. A calm, professional voice asked if I was Daniel's wife. The question alone drained the color from the room. I said yes. There was a pause, then the words I had been dreading without fully admitting it. He had been admitted earlier that evening after experiencing chest pain. He was stable, the voice clarified quickly, but he was under observation. Stable, under observation. I closed my eyes and pressed my free hand against my forehead, trying to anchor myself to those two phrases. "Did he ask for me?" I heard myself say, and there was another pause before the nurse answered that he had listed me as his emergency contact this time. That detail struck deeper than the diagnosis. He had removed my name months ago, and now, in whatever moment had led him to that hospital, he had written it back down. I asked which hospital, scribbled the name onto the back of the insurance policy, and ended the call with a mechanical thank you. The house felt unbearably still as the reality settled in. He had not just left to create distance. He had left while managing a body that was beginning to fail him, and he had ended up 2 hours away, alone, before deciding to let them call me. I grabbed my keys without thinking, then stopped mid-step. Our son. I couldn't just disappear into the night the way Daniel had. I walked upstairs and told him calmly that his dad was in the hospital but stable, that I was going to drive out there, that I would call as soon as I knew more. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and something else. Relief, maybe, that the waiting was over. Back downstairs, I paused one last time in the kitchen. The settlement check was still there, untouched since the moment I laid it down. I picked it up and slid it into my purse, not because it mattered now, but because leaving it behind felt symbolic in a way I couldn't afford. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and stepped into the night air that felt sharper than it had earlier. As I drove onto the highway, the dashboard lights glowing softly against the dark, a single question looped through my mind with relentless clarity. When I walk into that hospital room, will I still have time to say the things I should have said months ago, or has the waiting finally run out for both of us? As I drove through the dark stretch of highway toward the hospital, the glow of the dashboard lights felt unreal against the heaviness in my chest, and every mile seemed to replay the same question over and over. Had I already waited too long? The city lights appeared gradually on the horizon, and when I finally pulled into the hospital parking lot, the building rose before me in cold white brightness, sterile and indifferent to whatever history had brought us here. I sat in the car for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, steadying my breathing the way I used to before stepping into court. Only this time there was no argument to prepare, no evidence to arrange, just a man I might lose if I didn't walk in and say what should have been said months ago. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and overbrewed coffee. The receptionist directed me to the cardiac observation unit, her voice calm in a way that suggested this was routine, that hearts falter every night in rooms like these. But this heart was Daniel's, and routine meant nothing to me now. When I reached his door, I paused, my hand hovering inches from the handle, remembering the security footage of him standing outside my office door, hesitating. The parallel struck hard. This was my turn to knock. I pushed the door open quietly. He was lying propped up against white pillows, hospital bracelet loose around his wrist, the steady rhythm of a heart monitor filling the silence between us. He looked smaller somehow, not physically diminished, but stripped of the quiet strength I had always associated with him. His eyes opened at the sound of the door, and for a second neither of us spoke. There was no anger in his expression, no accusation, just surprise, and something softer beneath it. "You won?" he asked, his voice rough but steady. The question broke something inside me. Even here, even like this, he was thinking about the verdict. I nodded, stepping closer to the bed. "Yes," I said, and then the truth followed without rehearsal. "But it doesn't feel like it." A faint smile touched his mouth, the kind that used to disarm me during arguments. "I figured you would," he murmured. I moved to the side of the bed and took his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin, the slight tremor in his fingers. "Why didn't you tell me it was this serious?" I asked, my voice no longer controlled. He looked at the ceiling for a moment before answering. "You were already fighting so hard. I didn't want to become another thing you had to manage." The words landed exactly where they should have months ago. I tightened my grip on his hand. "You were never something to manage," I said, and for the first time in a long while, I meant it without distraction. "You were the reason I thought any of it mattered." He turned his head slightly to look at me, studying my face as if searching for something he hadn't seen in a long time. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," he said quietly. "I left because I didn't know how to reach you anymore." Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't look away. "I know," I whispered. "I saw the footage. You stood outside my door." He closed his eyes briefly, exhaling. "I kept thinking you'd come out." The steady beeping of the monitor filled the space between us again, but it no longer sounded mechanical. It sounded fragile. I leaned closer, pressing my forehead gently against his hand. "I'm here now," I said, aware of how small those words were compared to the distance we had allowed to grow. "And I'm not fighting anyone tonight." He squeezed my hand weakly, and in that small movement I felt both how much we had nearly lost and how uncertain everything still was. The doctor would come in with explanations and treatment plans, with percentages and precautions. There would be follow-up appointments, lifestyle changes, conversations with our son. None of it would be simple. But as I stood beside his bed, the settlement check forgotten in my purse and the lawsuit already fading into something distant, I understood with painful clarity that the only victory that mattered now was whether we could find our way back to each other before the waiting turned into something permanent. And as the monitor continued its steady rhythm, I realized that this time I would be the one who refused to stay behind a closed door.